Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to Home Education Matters. I am joined today by Jemma Zoe Smith, who is going to be talking with me about times tables and how to approach them as a home educator. And I have a lot of experience of this, so I'm quite looking forward to talking about this. But first of all, before we launch in, hello, and do tell us a little bit about yourself and your tuition background, teaching background, and all your experience with home ed.
All right. Thanks ever so much for having me. My name is Jemma Zoe Smith. I come at home ed, I suppose, from a bit of an unusual background in that I currently do not have children. And I'm going to be really honest and say that straight away. But when I do plan to home ed. So it's something that's very clear in my mind. I qualified as a secondary science teacher a couple of years ago. Well, a bit longer than that now. But tuition is very much where I sit. So I believe in a one-to-one, in a very bespoke model of education, and that is where I come at home ed from. I have worked with home educators and homeschoolers over in the US probably for about 8 years, in a variety of different ways, in that certainly for some of my students, they are homeschooling, so they are doing school at home. And for some of them, they world school as well, so they're traveling whilst doing so. And I'm really fortunate in that sometimes I go out and I see them physically, so I will travel with them. And then others are home educated, and I will come in and work with them for short amounts of time. So I've got some home editors here in Oxfordshire, which is where I'm based, and they will either come to me or meet with me online, and we will tackle not necessarily the curriculum, because again it depends on an individual's choice, but we will especially in math, which is kind of the area that maths and science is very much my thing. So we will tackle it so that either they're going down an interest-led route, or they're thinking about doing a qualification, or it really depends. So I kind of go across quite a broad range, I suppose, from those that are fully schooling at home to those that are choosing and really going down their own interest path.
And you cover a few different age groups as well, do you?
Yeah, I do. So again, it's maybe more unusual as a tutor to do so, but because I work with families who will, the families sometimes that I work with will be abroad, will be traveling, and will want somebody who can go with them. And therefore I end up doing quite a wide range of ages and a quite wide range of subjects. So often if I'm working with a family, and often what happens is they've taken a year out of school, or they've decided that they're going to do a fairly complicated family move, and they're going to take them out for a little bit, but they still want, often with those families, they still want to reintegrate later on into schooling. So I end up doing the whole family. And so I will work with students from probably about 7 all the way up to around 16. And again, a fairly wide range of subjects, because if you're taking someone with you on that kind of journey, you want to make sure that they can cover lots of things. But math is always a common. So everyone in some form ends up doing some math with me, even if they don't necessarily know that they're doing it sometimes when they first will start, which is the fun bit for me, because I get to
sneak maths in.
Exactly. I get to do that. I get to do the fun bits of math that you don't normally get to do when you're having to work towards a particular qualification, or when you're teaching in a school. It's not, you don't get to do that fun, interest-led bit, which for me as a tutor is really fun.
I've yet to encounter fun maths, so I've managed to teach both my children maths all the way through, and I've not encountered fun maths. So I've been doing it wrong.
I love math.
Someone's got to, though, haven't they? So times tables, I think teaching times tables is one of those that I think I have use the most time, energy, and money on resources when it comes to times tables. My son learnt times tables the old-fashioned way, using a little Kumon flick chart thing he had with all of it, and he just read them to
Goes
himself,
through
and
and
2
through and
weeks
through.
later he memorized them all. My daughter, who's dyslexic, refuses to remember anything that she considers boring, which is all maths facts. And so as a result, even now, and she's 14 and studying her GCSEs, even now she cannot remember certain aspects of her times tables. And I have put I even wrote an entire story, whole storybook based on characters that were numbers,
Yep.
like interacting with each other. And I've done every single resource there is available for times tables. There's nothing I haven't tried for times tables, and she still doesn't know her times tables. So please help us, because it's not always that. It's some children, they love it, right? Some children, they just
Some
fly.
do. Yeah.
And others, it can be years and years. And I find with the curriculum that we were blocking ourselves because she couldn't remember her times table. So for about 2 years, we never really went anywhere with maths, because we were just stopped at this times tables. And then after a while, I just thought, you know what, she's not going to remember them, so I'm just going to move on
So
and
just
let her
keep
use a
going.
calculator. Yeah,
Keep going. So I like to start times tables as early as possible, and I think that's something that school doesn't really do.
What sort of age are you talking there?
From go.
Like 4, 5?
Yeah, 4,
Yeah.
5. Yeah. So really early on, because if we can start making associations between things like pairs, then you can start to see how the times tables impact real life. One of my favorite things to do with students, which is maybe I recommend to do, is to take your children shopping, because it's exactly where you find multiples of stuff. So you get bags of oranges, and bags of oranges come in a 6 or a 12, and you can say, okay, well, let's get 2 of them and count them. And you're using those skills from really early on. And you can increase the difficulty. You can say, oh, each one of these costs me £3, so how much is it going to cost? And so you're using math in real life is something that is really important. I think the earlier you start a child with that, the better it is, because the more natural it becomes. So with that, shopping often comes in. And also when you're at home, things like baking, things like making sure that you are scaling recipes. So again, with lots of my students, I bake pizza, and I will make cakes with them, and I will say to them, oh no, I've only got the recipe, with a bit older this time, but I've only got the recipe for 4 and we want to make 12. So what am I going to need to do? I'm not anti-calculator, I think is probably it as well, in that I will, when I work with a student and we're using those times tables, so we've put down there's 2 eggs for to serve 4 people, and now we need to scale it up and we need to serve 12 people. If there's a calculator on hand and it helps them to feel better, they know what they're doing. So right, okay, first of all, what's the sum that you're putting in the calculator? Then what do you think the answer will be? Then let's check the answer. And by using those different steps, it helps them to gain that confidence. They're not feeling like, oh, I have to do it, and if it goes wrong, then it's my fault. And I can tell what they're doing. So physical manipulatives are probably the biggest thing. And by that, I mean just things that we can move, like eggs. If you are saying they come in pairs, you can pick them up two by two. You say, right, okay, when I teach some of my homemakers, when I've seen them, it's usually the first time that they see math sometimes with me. And so when I talk about times table, I talk about buckets. And I say, okay, I've got one bucket full of 2 eggs, and I need 2 buckets. How many are there in the 2 buckets? And I will bring along little like sandcastle buckets, and we'll put stuff into them so they can physically see it, they can back it up, and then they could use it. And that also helps between the whole maths is pointless, why am I learning this? Because if you can physically see it work, then it helps to be able to link it to real life. So that's probably one of the big ones.
You mentioned that you ask them what the sum is that they would put into the calculator. Then they estimate what they think the answer is going to be, and then they do the calculation. I
Yeah.
find that my daughter really struggles at the first step, which is, working out where she plugs the numbers in. Like, is it 12 divided by 4 or is it
Yep.
4 divided by 12? And is there any kind of helpful route to help that?
Language, I think, makes a big difference. So when we first of all taught students about math, we use divide, we use words that we don't normally use in conversation, and that can confuse them, I find. Um, so even with some of my older students, I've got students who are taking GCSEs who are home educated. We won't necessarily always say divide, we'll say split. So I need to split 12 into 4. And what I mean by that is, I'll go one step further. I need to split 12 into 4 buckets.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got 12 things and I'm putting them in 4 buckets. And if they can explain that to me, then I have, like, a visual cue, so a little poster which says 12 in this many buckets, and sticking like Velcro numbers. That's the one. So if you can put I've got 15 and I need to split it into 3 buckets, then this is what it should look like as a divide. It's 15 divided by 3, because I'm splitting it into those buckets. So being able to link the language that we normally use, because often when they feel like they're forced to put down a sum, they panic. I find anyway.
Yeah.
And that means that you kind of get the rabbit in headlights, and then you usually get that I don't want to do it, and then this is stupid, and then we're gone, it's too far, can't come back. Whereas if we discuss it with them and I say, okay, right, and I will set out, I've got 15 pencils, what do I need to do? And if they can show me, right, you're physically splitting it, okay, right, now I know that you understand it. So then it's moving it from everyday language into math language. So if you know that they can split 15 into 3 buckets, and that's the way that they're thinking about it, then having that little poster, that little visual reminder to say 15 divided by 3 is 15 split into 3 buckets, then that can just help them to remember it whilst they're going through sums, whilst they're going through kind of questions.
So I get the impression that when you're teaching times tables or multiplication, that you're also teaching division at the same time. Is that how you
Yeah.
do it?
Multiplication and division, they go together for me, because otherwise I find that you're teaching the same thing twice. Multiplication tables, I might as well do it alongside a division, because I don't see them as separate skills. And again, it's something that with home ed you get the opportunity to not necessarily follow a age-related curriculum. And I particularly, when I teach home eders, that they're often not at the age that they would be in school. I teach some that are way ahead, and I teach some that are needing support. And I think multiplication division is something that got split in school. And often we find that long division is the bit that everyone hates, because it's on its own, it's taught on its own, it doesn't seem like it relates to anything else. Whereas if you put multiplication and division together and you can become fluent with using them, then, as you said at the start, it opens up everything else. Because sometimes it's not about the memory of multiplication, it's about the use of it, being able to master the skill of timesing up and dividing down can help you to work out what you need to do in word related problems, in other areas of math. And yeah, so I combine them when I teach them.
And at what point would you bring in learning by rote when it comes to multiplication tables, or would you not?
I do. It depends on the student for me. So interestingly, you mentioned your daughter's dyslexic, is that correct? Yeah, I'm dyslexic as well. And so the whole memorizing something, learning something, it can be tricky. I find I actually quite enjoy getting things into my long-term memory, and I kind of see it as a challenge. And I have a lot of memory techniques. As a kid, I was really interested. That was the thing I was interested in, was how can you memorize a deck of cards? How can you do that? All those memory tricks. And I find that those can be quite fun in terms of learning something, just for the sake of memorizing it. In terms of memorizing a multiplication, I rarely do it. Especially if I'm trying to think about the way that I would do 8 times table, because 8 times table is the one that most people will struggle with.
Mm.
And often I, instead of memorizing it rote, as in 1 times 8 is 8, 2 times 8 is 16, I will help students to memorize certain bits of it. So 10 times 8 is 80, should be okay because we stick a 0 on the end. 1 times 8 is 8, should be fine. Double 8 is 16, should be okay. 5 eighths, that's half of 10. So half of 10 is 40. Half of 10 times 8, which is 80, is 40. And so then you've got 1, 2, 5, and 10. And then you've got that tricky bit that people hate, which is the 7 times 8, 8 times 8, and 9 times 8. And with that, you can rote learn it. I don't. Instead, what I do is I work on a step up, step down. So I say to them, again, it's a visual thing. Imagine that you're standing on the 80th rung of a ladder. How many do you need to step down to go to 9 times 8? How many do you need to step up to go to 11? And get them to work out skip counting. So can you do 9 times from 10 times? And then sometimes students will turn around and say to me, but Gemma, I'd rather just know it. And that's the point that I bring in rote. When a student has said to me, I'd rather just remember it. I don't want to have to do this kind of step up, step down. But as a math teacher, I'd rather that they know the mathematical principle behind it, because then they can work out 14 times 8 if they really want, because at some point rote runs out. But when it comes to rote learning, again, I tend not to do it as 8 times 7 is this, 8 times 8 is this, 8 times 9 is this. Instead, I'll do it via rhyme or via dance, something that's going to create a bigger memory than just standing up and reciting. So I ate and I ate till sick on the floor. 8 times 8 is 64 is a one that
I bet that's popular with the students.
Yeah. So, but it helps you to remember 8 eighths, and therefore, if I can remember 8 eighths, and then you can work out 9 eighths, you can do it that way. You can do it as some of my students have like a little dance that they do for it, where, because it's podcast, I can't show you it, but it's it involves a lot of wiggling for eights. But again, you see them using it, and even if they're doing it whilst they're thinking about, okay, I'm doing 8, and I'm doing times 8, and then I've got this, and you've got like 64 coming out, and they can remember it through that movement. It helps, again, it just helps with memory. When I was really young and I was interested in learning a deck of cards, the biggest thing that I remember reading was make it big, make it memorable. So just like I ate and I ate till sick on the floor, that's got a really interesting image to it. Everyone can think of it. And the same thing with a dance, everyone can think of the shape that it makes, or if that's the way that you learn, then that helps you to remember. So rather than your kind of simple just write down and it all looks a bit similar to me, I prefer to do something that is big, that is bold, and that they might only remember one bit of it, but that's an extra one that you can add to your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and as you say, if you know 8 times 8, then theoretically they can work out 7 times 8 and 9 times 8 from that.
Yeah, so then you've got, and if you need 6 lots of 8, then you can go from 5 lots of 8. So if you can work out how to get up and down, then you might take a little bit longer than someone who has memorized it, and that is true. You will spend longer on it, and that is an advantage of rote learning. But for somebody who's really struggling to rote learn, then just saying to them, right, you've got these 6 things that you've learned, 6 parts of the times table, go up, go down, can sometimes feel like a big relief.
Is there a point at which you would just sort of ditch off times tables and say, "Do you know what? We're not going to get this," or would you keep ploughing on until they've got them all?
Oh, there's a question. I've had this issue with one of my students, you see.
Mm.
So one of my students really struggles with times table. We've worked a bit on it, and this year she's chosen to start to do the math GCSE. They weren't sure they were going to do any exams, and so it wasn't something that we put a lot of emphasis on, because we worked through manipulatives and we worked through use of math in other areas. But now that she's doing the GCSE, the knowledge of times tables and being able to recall them becomes a lot more important. And what I have done is we know the majority of them. We don't know all of them. But again, as long as they know what to do, and here we've been quite specific with the GCSEs that we're taking, so we're using calculator based. That is, again, if she knows what she's going to put into a calculator, then I'm happier for that. I do like to bring it in because I think it's a useful skill to have. But for some students, if it's not going, they're not going to use math beyond a GCSE. They are very happy with using the calculator. They're very confident with what it means. Then I'm less worried about, yes, they know up to 12 times 12, because if you know how to work it out and you know the math principles behind it, then for me that helps. And I know that there'll be some people out there going, no, I absolutely think that they should know up to 12 times 12. And there are many teachers out there that would think it's heresy that someone doesn't. But for me, math should be something that you can apply. And so if you know what you need to apply, for example, in GCSEs, there is a bit in certain specs where you have to memorize cos of certain angles. I don't memorize them. I learn them before I go into an exam and then write them down, because it's not relevant to my day-to-day life. And so I don't see why I would learn them. Very much like your daughter there. It's not relevant to me, so I'm not going to memorize it. I think, for some students it's useful, for some students it's not. As long as you can move past it, I think as long as you can do it, you know what you need to put into the calculator, what you need to split into the buckets, what you need to, whereabouts estimation it's right. So again, what kind of numbers is it near? Is it near 60? Is it near 50? And that way you can check your answers. I'm going to go out on a limb on that. I don't think it's needing to be memorized.
I think as well, it's that fine line, isn't it, between your child knowing maths facts and enjoying maths. And there comes a point, but I've noticed teaching maths myself to my daughter, that there comes a point where I'm in danger of totally alienating her from the subject, just in order to get her to know sort of 6 or 7 times tables that she perhaps doesn't know when she knows all the rest of them.
Exactly. That's why I think if you can work it out, there's less point pushing for it, especially if they can get round it. I think as long as you can get round it in most areas, that's probably the way that I feel about education. Education for me isn't memorizing a whole load of facts. It's learning, and that's different to memory. And so I'd be really disappointed if a student of mine came out and they said, I don't understand what I'm doing, but I've memorized it. And I'd rather it be the other way around. I do understand what I'm doing, but I haven't memorized it. So
Yeah.
I think that's the way I fall on it.
We interrupt this broadcast to remind you to like and subscribe to our podcast. And don't forget to join our Home Education Matters Facebook group, where you can find details on all our podcasts, any links or resources mentioned, chat to our guests, request upcoming podcasts, and even come on the podcast yourself. Do join us over there.
One thing I found was that we were very happy to ditch off times tables ultimately, but when we got to fractions, she got very stuck on lowest common denominators, because she couldn't see a number like 64 and instantly know what sort of numbers would go into it, because she hadn't got that memorized. And so I mean, obviously ultimately we're doing the calculator exam, and so I said, look, just use your calculator. But that for me felt like a bit of a failure, because I wanted her to be able to see that kind of pattern between numbers.
I think the pattern part, so in terms of kind of lowest common denominator, being able to cancel fractions, I would say if you can do it with a 2, if you can do it with a 3, again, it's going to take you longer.
Mm.
And again, it's about explaining to a student, especially when they're that age, that it's a time thing. So if they want to put the time and the effort into memorizing, rote learning, doing it every single day, standing in front of the mirror and reciting it, and that is very much what you can do. A great memory technique is to have one room in your house that is for every single times table. So you might have the front garden, which is the 5 times table. You might have the living room, which is the 3 times table. Every time you go through that door, you say the times table. It gets really repetitive, but it can be a great way of associating it. If you associate it with different places, different numbers, different, all sorts of amazingly fun memory techniques. Or when you go and do your division for fractions, you have to start at 2 instead of starting at an 8. And that's you eventually you'll get to the same answer, but it's going to take you longer. And that might mean that in an exam you lose time on that bit. So it's a way up between different styles. Someone who is very fluent with their times tables will find those questions easier and will be, quicker on them. But it's at that point, I do think there is an individual learner's choice whether they choose to memorize the whole thing. Another thing that I do with my students is we have what we call a one sheet. So a one sheet exists before you take any exam, short-term memory, anything you can write on one piece of paper. So for GCSE math, actually, it comes up quite a lot. Circle theorems is usually the thing that they write on their one sheet. Can't remember it all. Those cos, sine, tan values, if they have to memorize them. Sometimes the names of alternate angles in a parallel line. And then I say to them, look, open the paper, write them down, because that way your short-term memory is going to deal with it, and you're going to be able to do the paper, and you're not going to have to keep it in your head for that long. And if that is that you've got 4 times tables that you need to, or 4 lines of multiplication that you need to remember, then that can easily be written down in an exam. And the moment that anyone says start the exam, you can turn over and write it down. So there's always ways around it. The easiest way is to memorize them. But if you're finding that there's a student who really is resistant against it and they're really struggling with it, for me, the self-esteem and making sure that they've got the confidence to answer math, I don't want to do away with that just by saying you've got to do this and forcing them to memorize a times table.
Is there value in doing times tables every day? And if so, how long would you do that for?
I love doing them every day, especially with younger students. But we do it via music and dance. So again, it's about memory making. And so we will pick, and I'm thinking about a specific student here. I had, as I said, I teach in families usually. So I had all 3 students, and they were home educating for a year. So, and I was brought in as a tutor for them. And the youngest one was struggling with times tables. So every day we would put on this, you can get them on YouTube, times table songs. And we'd dance around pre-breakfast. So we'd pick one, we'd do it, we'd go through it a couple of times, and we'd try and involve some of the other members of the house. He had older brothers, and oh, it's not very cool. I was like, yeah, but you're going to do it, aren't you? And so again, it's familiarity. And so if they can put any type of memory to it, they can put the memory of dancing before they eat breakfast. Again, make it fun, make it memorable. And yeah, I enjoy it. But the moment it becomes a chore, then it's not really worth it. Because again, as you said, you get the pushback, and you get the point where a student doesn't want to learn. And often if they associate those times tables just with math, it becomes a nightmare to teach math. Even if the math you're teaching has nothing to do with multiplication stuff, it can still be a barrier. So I try and separate them as well. So I try and think of times tables as its own little thing. So you can there's a cool book out there about it's about how you use your hands to do times tables. So you can do the 11 times tables purely with your hands. You can do the 8s and the 9s as well. And again, we might take one of those, but we would do it separate to doing math, just because if that's the bit that they're struggling with, I don't want them to be associating times tables and math. So we separate them quite often.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice, because it took me a couple of years with my daughter to disassociate her negative experiences with times tables from maths generally. And annoyingly, she was very bad at memorizing times tables, but she's very good at maths. And it took her a long time to recognize that, because she associated maths only with times tables.
Yeah. So doing them separate, having a separate times table time can be really useful, because then you can put as much energy and effort into times tables, and then you could go away and do other maths. And other math is fine, and showing them that they can do it. Often that confidence helps, because they can take that confidence of, you know what, I can do this. I can do math, especially once they realize that it is possible. Then they can take that confidence through and apply it. And there's all sorts of other things that I suppose I do with math that and multiplication as well is things like, if you're doing history and they're really into history, using timelines to say, oh, look, okay, that happened in a series of 4 years, or this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And oh, look, they make a pattern. So again, kind of linking it back. If they're into particular computer games, you can work on sequences, and you can do sequences in different kind of Minecraft games, and looking at, okay, well, if the most recent one that I've been doing with a student is trading. So if 3 of these goes to make 1 of these, so if I have 3 wheat and they go to make 1 corn, one sheep, sorry, then how many wheats will I need to make 2 sheep? So just, again, changing it up and making it less about the multiplication and more about the area of interest or the area of focus in something else as well.
And so when you approach tuition, you would find out what the pupils' interests are and then sort of tailor your lessons around that.
Yeah, 100%. That for me is the best bit about tutoring, because
it's the best bit about home education, in fact.
Yeah. It's the reason I want a home ed. It's because the idea that you can base a whole, not even just a whole lesson. It can be a whole project. It can be the backbone of any learning experience, relating it to an interest, or relating it to one of many interests. I love when I travel with students, and if we're traveling, we see something that's new, and then being able to link that into, with my older ones, sometimes geography, science, math, and linking a whole thing together and saying, remember when we saw this, remember when we did this, and linking that back to something that you're learning is the fun bit. It's the bit where you can link math in there as well. People kind of shy away from math because they feel like it's not part of that experiential learning, but it can be. So, working out the price of admission to a museum, working out the price of 2 people's admission to that museum. What if we had 4 people in our party? And then, if you're going abroad or you're looking at other countries, looking at the exchange rate, and looking at, I recently have been with a student of mine, I've been looking at Weimar Republic, and looking at hyperinflation, Dawes Plan and Marshall Plan, and all that in history, and really going into hyperinflation. again, there's a whole load of math in there
Mm.
where the value of something drops. You get a bit of economics in there, but you also get a whole load of math. And so you can say, oh, an egg used to cost this amount, and then it did cost this amount. How much have we increased by? A factor of what? So it can always be interlinked. It's just often I feel like a curriculum doesn't necessarily do it. So it does require an educator to go in, and for you to go in with the idea of, okay, I'm going to link this. I'm going to link these subjects together. And I think that's something that home editors are really good at, because you've got an overview of your child's education. So if you know what they're doing across every level, then you can link everything together.
I think a lot of that comes back down to confidence, doesn't it? Because a lot of parents don't feel confident enough in their own mathematical skills to then be able to sort of go to these ticket booths and know what the answer would be. So can they help their child through that?
Bring a calculator.
It's always on your phone, isn't it? Let's face it.
Exactly. And it also then it normalizes estimation. So if you can round up, round down, estimate, and say, make it into a game, make it into a kind of guessing game, really. Who can get closest? So who can get closest when we're in the queue, before we're at the point of turning up to the ticket booth? Who can work out how much it would cost? Who gets closest to it? And take part in it yourselves, because I think there's a view in home ed sometimes that if I can't do it, then I can't teach it. But if you asked any math teacher while they're in the queue for a cinema, they won't be able to work it out, because everyone's human and everyone makes mistakes. And so being able to show your children that aspect as well, that sometimes there's strengths within each of us about what we can work out, what we can't, and helping them normalize that, I think, is a useful lesson.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that as well is countering that sort of that perfectionism that pupils or that children sometimes fall into, where they feel like if they don't know everything straight away, then bin the whole thing off. I'm rubbish at it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Whereas if you can show them that actually I don't do that, I don't know how to do it either, or I'm going to take a little bit longer, then it helps to show them that everyone gets there when they work on it, and everyone has those different strengths. As I said right at the start, English isn't my wheelhouse, but I still will work alongside students. When I'm doing GCSE work, I do the paper with them, so they can see what my answer would be. And my answer is often wrong, because I'm not perfect, because no one is. But by seeing my answer and seeing their answer, then they can see, okay, that's how we'd work it out. There's nothing wrong in being wrong. And I think that's, for me, that's useful to show people. So I will do all the GCSE exams. I do them every year. It's I do them alongside my students, and often, we're getting to the point where we want to get to the point where a student's better than us, because at that point they're ready for an exam.
Exactly.
We haven't learned it the way that they have, so let's get them to the point where they're better.
Well, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Gemma. And Gemma will be joining us in our Facebook group, our Home Education Matters Facebook group. So if anyone listening has any specific questions they'd like to ask her, do come on that group, and then she can help you out in any way then. And where can people find you if they wanted to online, Gemma? Do you have a website, Facebook groups, that kind of thing?
Yep, we do. So I run a tuition agency. It's called the Education Hotel. And so people, pretty much, if you type the Education Hotel into anywhere, we should pop up. Me personally, on Instagram, I go as Top Travel Tutor, and that's mostly when I travel with clients. You'll see the bits that I do there. Those are probably the two best ways to get hold of me.
Very nice. Will you be world schooling your children when you have your own little home ed children?
I'll be home edding. I'm not sure whether we'll have the funds to world school, but we will be. It will be. Well, the hope is that it will be a bit different, I suppose, to school in terms of emphasis. My partner is a musician. I obviously teach, but we put a bit more emphasis on the arts, and a bit more emphasis on the world around us. And so I have some slightly different lessons than the norm. Photography is one that has been discussed before. And again, introducing things like multiplication from a really young age, those types of things are things that I think I'm quite clear about, wanting academics to be kind of integrated with our lives, but also for there to be additional opportunities to be maybe more artistic, to develop those skills compared to being in a traditional school, because we're very lucky to be able to have that experience for both of us. We're lucky to have enough instruments to have a whole entire orchestra in my house, but so hopefully we'll be able to provide that kind of experience. And I'd love to world school them, and it's definitely something that I'm quite keen on, but we'll have to see how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I world schooled my children for about 10 years and it was wonderful. But we didn't have our own tutor, alas. That would have been really nice. I was the travelling tutor.
There you are.
Well, thank you so much, Gemma. That's been wonderful, and look forward to seeing you on the Facebook group.
Oh, brilliant. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.